The rumble of the boat's engine was a dull throb against Dean's ribs, a physical manifestation of the journey's relentless monotony. Salt spray, fine and cold, kissed his face, tasting of rust and distant storm. He hunched deeper into his oilskin coat, the collar pulled high against the insistent wind. The mainland had receded hours ago, swallowed by the slate-gray ocean and a deepening shroud of fog that clung to the water like a hungry spirit. He hadn't looked back. There was nothing left there for him but the echoing silence of an empty house, a life that had fractured into irreparable pieces. His grief was a constant leaden weight, a phantom limb ache that pulsed beneath his sternum. It wasn't a fresh wound, but a scar tissue that still throbbed with unspent agony. The cartographer in him, the man who once meticulously charted coastlines and mountain ranges, now found himself adrift, his internal compass spinning wildly. This island, this remote, forgotten speck of rock, was to be his last refuge, a place to redraw the boundaries of his existence, or perhaps, simply to disappear. The boatman, a man of few words and weather-beaten features, pointed a calloused finger through the swirling mist. "There," he grunted, his voice a low rasp over the engine. Dean squinted. Through a momentary thinning in the vapor, a colossal, jagged silhouette emerged. It wasn't the lighthouse, not yet. This was something else entirely, a sprawling, skeletal structure of pitted iron and crumbling brick, its smokestacks like broken fingers clawing at the sky. A derelict factory, its vacant windows staring out at the ocean like dead eyes. It looked ancient, abandoned decades ago, a monument to forgotten industry and decay. It was a place of ghosts, he thought, a testament to ruin. The boat slowed, its bow cutting a path through choppy water towards a small, barnacle-encrusted dock. The fog thickened again, swallowing the factory and muting the world to shades of gray. The only sounds were the slap of water against the hull and the mournful cries of gulls, their calls thin and sharp, like slivers of glass. He disembarked onto the slick, seaweed-strewn planks, his sea legs still protesting. The air here was heavy, saturated with brine and something else, something earthy and damp, like decaying vegetation and wet stone. The boatman, without a word, began to unload Dean's meager possessions. A worn leather trunk, a rucksack, a sturdy wooden crate of cartography tools. "Path's that way," the boatman said, pointing towards a barely discernible track winding up a low rise. "Should be able to see the light from the top." He took Dean's payment without counting it, a transaction devoid of pleasantries. The engine sputtered back to life, and the boat, its purpose served, turned and vanished into the fog, leaving Dean utterly alone. Dean shouldered his rucksack, gripping the handle of the trunk. The path was overgrown, choked with thorny brambles and tough, salt-blasted grasses. Each step was a struggle, his boots sinking into the soft, boggy earth. He felt the island pressing in on him, a vast, indifferent presence. He walked for what felt like an eternity, the fog swirling around him, sometimes thick enough to obscure his hand before his face, then briefly parting to reveal glimpses of the barren landscape. Twisted, stunted trees clung to the rocky slopes, their branches gnarled like arthritic fingers. He could feel the tremor in his hands, a residual anxiety from the journey, or perhaps something new entirely. Then, through a sudden rift in the mist, it appeared. The lighthouse. And nestled beside it, hunkered low against the wind, was the cottage. His grandfather's cottage. It was smaller than he remembered from the old photographs, and far more dilapidated. The whitewash was peeling in great flakes, revealing the weathered gray wood beneath. Windows, thick with grime, stared blankly out at the ocean. The small porch sagged precariously, and a broken shutter hung askew, rattling in the wind like a loose tooth. A dense tangle of thorny bushes, long past their flowering, clawed at the walls. It looked less like a home and more like a tombstone. A strange, acrid smell, like damp earth and something vaguely metallic, permeated the air around the cottage. He approached slowly, his steps crunching on a carpet of fallen leaves and tiny, sharp pebbles. A sense of immense age, of forgotten lives and untold stories seemed to emanate from the very stones. He paused at the warped wooden door, its paint faded to a ghostly gray. The door groaned open with a mournful shriek, protesting its long slumber. A wave of stale, musty air, heavy with the scent of mildew and dust, washed over him. He stepped inside, into the gloom. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the grimy windows. Cobwebs, thick and gray, draped from every corner like forgotten tapestries. The floorboards creaked under his weight, a symphony of decay. He could almost feel the presence of his grandfather, a man he barely knew, a recluse even more profound than Dean himself. The memory of his own loss, fresh and raw, resurfaced, mingling with the unfamiliar melancholy of this place. In the main room, a heavy, salt-stained table stood sentinel, surrounded by 3 wooden chairs. A faint outline on the wall suggested where a painting once hung. Everything was covered in a fine, silken layer of dust. He walked slowly, his boots scuffing the floor. He stopped, his head cocked slightly. A sound. Faint, almost imperceptible. A low, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like something far beneath the floorboards, a slow, deliberate pulse. He held his breath, straining his ears, but it ceased as quickly as it had begun. Just the house settling, he told himself, the old wood groaning under the weight of time and neglect. Yet, a prickle of unease traced its way up his spine. He scanned the room, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. Nothing. But then, in the very periphery of his vision, he caught a flicker of movement by the far wall, near the boarded-up fireplace. A quick, serpentine shift, too fast to properly register, too indistinct to be anything but a trick of the light or his exhausted mind. Dean exhaled slowly, the breath catching in his throat. He was tired, grief-stricken, and utterly alone on a desolate island. His mind was playing tricks. It had to be. He was here, now, and something, ancient and vast, seemed to stir just beyond the threshold of his perception. The ferry's whistle, a mournful shriek, was the last sound of the mainland Dean heard as the vessel pulled away, leaving him on the rocky shore of the island. The lighthouse keeper's cottage, a squat stone sentinel, stood silhouetted against a bruised sky. A single gull wheeled overhead, its cry thin and reedy, a sound that seemed to stretch the silence rather than break it. Dean felt the weight of the island settle on his shoulders, a heavy cloak woven from salt and isolation. He wrestled his duffel bag and a crate of supplies up the uneven path, his boots crunching on loose shale. The air here was thicker, colder, tasting of brine and something else. Something ancient and damp, like earth disturbed after a long sleep. Inside, the cottage was a mausoleum of dust and forgotten air. The windows, thick with grime, filtered the afternoon light into weak, hazy shafts. A faint smell, a mingling of old wood, mildew, and something metallic, clung to the fabric of the place. Dean dropped his bags with a thud that echoed disproportionately in the small space. He ran a hand over a grimy windowsill, a fine layer of grit clinging to his fingertips. This was it. Solitude. A clean slate. He told himself this with a conviction he didn't quite feel. The first hint of disturbance came with the tide. Dean, a cartographer by trade, understood the ocean's rhythms. He'd spent years charting coastlines, predicting currents. But the tide that evening was wrong. It didn't recede with its usual languid sigh. Instead, it pulled back, then surged forward again, a restless, hungry motion that repeated itself. The water at the base of the cliffs seemed to breathe, inhaling and exhaling with an erratic, unnatural cadence. He dismissed it as an anomaly, perhaps a localized current, a quirk of the island's unique geology. The mind, he thought, seeks patterns, even in chaos. Not the howl of the wind itself, but something within it. A low, guttural murmur, like stones grinding together beneath immense pressure. He paused, a mug of lukewarm tea halfway to his lips, straining his ears. The sound seemed to pulse, to swell and recede with the erratic breathing of the tide. It wasn't words, not exactly, but the ghost of language, a primordial hum that resonated deep in his chest. He shook his head, running a hand through his hair. The isolation was getting to him, he decided. The wind played tricks. The old house groaned. Simple explanations for unsettling sensations. The next morning, driven by a restless energy he couldn't quite name, Dean began to explore. He found a rough, hand-drawn map tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the small pantry. It wasn't a cartographic marvel, but a crude sketch of the island, with several points marked by his grandfather's distinctive spidery script. One location, a jagged X near the northern cove, was circled repeatedly, the word derelict factory scrawled beside it. Below that, a single cryptic phrase, "The deep song calls from there." His grandfather had been a man of few words, a stoic presence Dean barely remembered. But this map, this note, felt like a direct summons. The derelict factory. He knew of it vaguely from the ferryman's brief, clipped directions. A relic of a failed fishing venture, long abandoned. The path to the factory was overgrown, thorny bushes snagging at his trousers, the air growing heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. The structure itself was a hulking silhouette against the gray sky, its corrugated iron skin pitted with rust, windows shattered like vacant eyes. Inside, the silence was absolute, broken only by the drip of water from the ceiling and the scuttling of unseen things. The floor was a mosaic of shattered glass and rotting debris. Shafts of weak light pierced the gloom through holes in the roof, illuminating swirling dust motes. He picked his way through the detritus, his boots echoing loudly. He found it tucked away in a corner, beneath a collapsed workbench, almost hidden by a mound of discarded nets and rusted tools. Water damage. He sat on an overturned crate, carefully prying open the stiff cover. The pages were brittle, crinkling under his touch. The script was his grandfather's, precise yet frantic in places. The early entries detailed mundane lighthouse duties, weather observations. But then, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew larger, more urgent, and the sketches began. Crude, disturbing images that made his breath catch in his throat. Not of fish or seabirds, but of impossible shapes, fluid and monstrous, with too many limbs, too many eyes. Scrawled across one particularly vivid sketch of a gaping maw rimmed with serrated teeth was the warning. The deep song. It reaches. It pulls. Another page, heavily underscored. The pact is broken. They rise. And then, repeatedly, almost obsessively, the phrase, "Do not listen, do not look, do not acknowledge." Dean closed the journal abruptly, the leather cover thudding softly. His hands trembled. This was not the work of a rational mind. His grandfather had been old, isolated. The sea could do strange things to a man's perception, he reasoned, could conjure phantoms in the lonely hours. The drawings were fevered imaginings, the words the ramblings of a man succumbing to age and solitude. He clutched the journal to his chest, the weight of it suddenly immense, a leaden anchor pulling him deeper into something he couldn't yet comprehend. The journal lay on the small, scarred table, a silent accuser. Dean had closed it, but the images of distorted fish and swirling abyssal depths refused to recede from his mind's eye. He'd tried to dismiss it all as the ramblings of an old man adrift in solitude, the sea's vastness distorting his perception. Yet, a cold, persistent current of unease had begun to flow beneath his composure. It wasn't just the drawings. It was the conviction in his grandfather's hurried script, the sheer desperation that bled through the ink. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something vital, a piece of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed. His cartographer's instinct, dormant since the tragedy that had driven him to this remote island, stirred. Maps, records, local history. If there was a story, a legend, a forgotten truth, it would be etched somewhere into the island's past. He needed context, something to ground his grandfather's increasingly disturbing entries in reality, or to definitively dismiss them as madness. The next morning, a thin, persistent fog clung to the cliffs, muffling the usual roar of the waves into a dull, distant sigh. Dean wrapped himself in a thick wool coat, the sea air biting at his exposed skin, and set out. The island's only settlement, a cluster of weather-beaten cottages and a single general store, offered little in the way of historical archives. The store owner, a stoic woman with hands gnarled from years of fishing nets, had merely shaken his head when Dean inquired about old records. Nothing much left. "Not after the storms," he'd said, his gaze lingering on him for a moment too long before he turned back to him ledgers. "Folk here, they don't keep much from the past. Better that way." Her words, rather than discouraging him, solidified his resolve. If the past was deliberately forgotten, there was likely a reason. He remembered an old, crumbling structure marked on one of his grandfather's less detailed hand-drawn maps of the island's interior, a place simply labeled Factory Derelict. It was a long walk, winding along narrow, overgrown paths that snaked through gorse and heather. The need to understand pushed him forward. The derelict factory emerged from the fog like a skeletal beast, its rusted corrugated iron siding torn and flapping in the occasional gusts of wind. A faint metallic tang, mixed with the damp earth, hung in the air. The main doors, once heavy steel, now sagged on broken hinges, offering a gaping maw into the gloom within. Machinery lay overturned, some pieces half submerged in shallow pools of murky water that had seeped through the cracked concrete floor. He moved carefully, his boots crunching on fallen debris, the sound echoing unnaturally in the cavernous space. He found what he was looking for in a small, relatively intact office at the back, its single window overlooking a sheer drop to the churning sea below. Shelves, once laden with ledgers, now held only detritus. A petrified bird's nest, a broken inkwell, and, beneath a pile of moldering newspapers, a stack of brittle, leather-bound volumes. These weren't factory records, but old island registers and local historical accounts, meticulously kept in a precise looping script that predated his grandfather's time. He blew dust from the first book, the fine particles tickling his nose. The entries were sparse, mostly births, deaths, and shipwrecks, but as he delved deeper, turning the fragile pages with utmost care, a pattern began to emerge. More unsettling were the recurring allusions to ancient rites performed by the islanders generations ago, sacrifices made to ensure the sea's bounty to keep something at bay. One faded newspaper clipping, tucked between two pages, spoke of a series of disappearances in the late 19th century, fishermen lost without a trace, and a subsequent sudden prosperity for the island's dwindling population. The article ended with a cryptic line. "The old ways, it seems, still hold sway over the hearts of men." Dean carried a few of the less decayed books back to the cottage, the weight of them feeling heavier than their actual mass. Back in the flickering lamplight, he reopened his grandfather's journal. They broke it. The offering ceased. It stirs. His grandfather hadn't been raving. He had been documenting. That night, the dreams came, more vivid and disturbing than any he'd experienced before. He was not in the cottage, but submerged, the crushing weight of the ocean pressing in on him. He saw vast cyclopean structures, impossibly ancient, rising from the inky blackness. Strange phosphorescent flora pulsed with an inner light, illuminating grotesque figures that moved with an unnatural fluidity, their forms shifting, half human, half something else, their eyes like chips of obsidian. He lay there for a long moment, heart hammering against his ribs, staring at the ceiling, trying to recall the details before they dissolved. His eyes traced the familiar lines of the rough-hewn wooden beams, seeking comfort in their solidity. That's when he saw it. Near the corner of the room, where the wall met the ceiling, a faint, ethereal glow pulsed. He pushed himself upright, his muscles stiff, and stumbled over. There, clinging to the dry wood, was a patch of something he'd never seen before. It wasn't just damp. It was growing here, indoors, away from any direct water source. The sea wasn't just outside his window anymore. It was seeping in. The frantic scrawl in his grandfather's journal, once dismissed as the ramblings of a man unmoored, now pulsed with a chilling clarity that resonated deep within Dean. The pact. They broke it. The unfinished sentence hung in the air, a silent accusation. He reread the words, his finger tracing the faded ink, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. But it was different. He pushed the journal aside, the pages rustling like dry leaves. He rose, restless, and walked to the small window overlooking the churning gray sea. The glass was streaked with salt and rain, reflecting his own image back at him. For a fraction of a second, his reflection wasn't quite right. He blinked, and it was gone, leaving only his tired, familiar features staring back. The hum intensified, a deeper resonance now, like a monstrous bell tolling far beneath the waves. A faint clatter came from the kitchen. Dean's muscles tensed. He moved cautiously, his footsteps muffled by the worn rug. On the small wooden counter, a ceramic mug, one he'd used for his morning tea, lay on its side, a thin trail of condensation marking where it had slid. He hadn't touched it since breakfast. He picked it up, his fingers trembling slightly. His grandfather's journal had contained several cryptic references to warding and the deep. Dean remembered a locked chest in the small, damp cellar beneath the cottage, something he hadn't yet explored. The cellar was small, a cramped space with shelves of ancient, rusted tools and forgotten preserves. With a groan of protest, the lock sprang open. There were dried, leathery pieces of what looked like seaweed, intricately woven into crude effigies. Small, polished stones, each with a single unsettling symbol carved into its surface, lay scattered. And then there were the bones. Not human, he hoped, but certainly animal. Ribs, vertebrae, a skull with an unnaturally elongated jaw, all meticulously cleaned and arranged, some bound with sinew, others etched with the same symbols as the stones. This wasn't just warding. This felt like something more primal, something that bordered on appeasement, on sacrifice. His grandfather hadn't just been trying to keep something out. He might have been trying to keep something fed. A small, folded map, yellowed and brittle, lay beneath the bones. It was a crude sketch of the island, with one location circled in thick, smudged charcoal: the derelict factory. The name was scrawled beside it, along with a single urgent word: source. The hum in the cottage above was now a palpable pressure against his eardrums. Dean felt an irresistible pull towards the factory, a morbid curiosity overriding his fear. He had to understand. He emerged from the cellar, the unsettling objects now a heavy presence in his mind. He grabbed his coat and flashlight, the old map clutched in his hand. The fog outside was thicker than ever, a churning, milky wall that swallowed the familiar landscape. He navigated by instinct and the faint, almost imperceptible contours of the path. The factory loomed out of the fog, a skeletal silhouette against the grays and whites. The gates, once formidable, hung askew on broken hinges, inviting him into its decaying maw. Inside, The vast space was a mausoleum of industry. Broken machinery lay scattered like the bones of some long-dead beast. The hum, no longer distant, resonated here with an almost physical force, vibrating through the concrete floor up into his boots. He moved deeper into the factory, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom, revealing strange scorch marks on the floor, crude carvings on a support pillar. The same symbols he'd seen on the stones in his grandfather's cellar. This was it. This was the source. Suddenly, a shift in the air. A profound drop in temperature, so sharp it stole his breath. The hum rose to a piercing crescendo that threatened to split his skull. His flashlight beam flickered, then dimmed, struggling against some unseen interference. What he saw was not solid, not truly defined. It had no discernible features, only a vast, silent hunger that radiated from its depths. He stumbled back, tripping over a loose piece of metal, hitting the ground hard. The flashlight clattered, its beam now a weak, dying pulse. He scrambled backwards, dragging himself away, his breath ragged. A loose sheet of corrugated iron, dislodged by the wind or some unseen force, slammed against a concrete pillar. The sudden, sharp noise seemed to momentarily disrupt the entity. Dean lay there, gasping, his body trembling uncontrollably. He pushed himself up, his limbs heavy, his mind reeling. He had seen it, he had felt it, and it had almost reached him. The pact, the broken pact, the source. It was all connected, and it was far more terrifying than any nightmare. They broke it. He reread the words, his finger tracing the faded ink, the parchment rough beneath his touch. It wasn't merely the words themselves, but the frantic energy behind them, the way certain letters were gouged deeper, as if written in a desperate hurry. He flipped back pages, then forward, searching for context. The preceding entries were mundane, observations on weather patterns, inventory lists for the lighthouse. But then the tone shifted abruptly. His grandfather hadn't just been a witness, he had been an active participant. Dean's eyes fixed on a diagram, crudely drawn but meticulously annotated. Along the perimeter, almost hidden in the margin, was a small, smudged note. Components sourced from the derelict factory. Specific calibration essential. The derelict factory. Dean remembered it, a hulking skeleton of rusted iron and broken glass on the far side of the island, a place he'd been warned away from as a child, full of hazardous debris and unstable structures. His grandfather had occasionally vanished there for hours, returning with odd metal pieces or lengths of wire, always evasive about his errands. Dean had assumed he was scavenging. As he stared at the page, a low thrum began to resonate in his ears. It was subtle at first, a deep, almost inaudible vibration, like a distant ship's engine struggling against heavy seas. He paused, tilting his head, listening. The sound wasn't coming from outside. The air in the cottage was still, heavy with the scent of brine and old paper. It was inside his head, a pressure building behind his temples, an ancient hum that felt as if it had been waiting for him. Another page, filled with frantic, almost illegible script. The deep song. It calls, "The mind unravels. Must maintain the ward." The words seemed to writhe on the page, the ink momentarily shimmering in his vision, blurring into indistinct shapes. He blinked, hard. The letters settled, but the thrumming intensified, a rhythmic pulse that echoed the beat of his own heart. The deep song. Was this what he was hearing? A profound unease settled over him, twisting his stomach into a knot. He glanced around the cottage, the familiar objects of his grandfather's life, the worn armchair, the chipped ceramic mugs, the stack of weathered sea charts, seemed to shimmer at the edges of his vision, their contours subtly shifting, then snapping back into place. He rubbed his eyes, but the sensation persisted, a fleeting distortion, a momentary slip in the fabric of what he knew to be real. His focus returned to the journal. It wasn't just a record. It was an instruction manual. His grandfather wasn't merely documenting the entity. He was actively engaged in keeping it contained, in feeding the pact. And now, the pact was broken. A new realization struck Dean with the force of a physical blow. The lighthouse itself, its powerful beam, its isolation. It wasn't just a beacon for ships. It was part of the ward. And the cottage, built into the very rock of the island, felt less like a home and more like a fortified chamber. Driven by a desperate impulse, Dean descended to the cellar, the journal clutched in his hand. He swept his lantern across the rough-hewn walls, the light dancing over shelves laden with forgotten tools, coils of rope, and empty crates. He remembered his grandfather's peculiar habit of always keeping a certain section of the cellar perpetually cluttered, piled high with old fishing nets and disused buoys. "Keeps the damp out," he'd always grumbled. But now, Dean saw the pattern in the clutter, a deliberate obstruction. He began to pull the objects away, one by one, the effort straining his muscles, the thrumming in his head a constant disorienting companion. Behind a stack of mildewed canvas and rusted crab traps, the wall wasn't rough stone like the rest. He ran his hand over it, feeling a faint seam. It wasn't part of the natural rock face. It was a door. It looked ancient, far older than the lighthouse itself. The wind, a raw blade off the northern sea, tore at Dean's coat as he trudged towards the derelict factory. Its silhouette, jagged against the bruised twilight, loomed like a petrified beast on the island's northernmost point. Every broken window pane, a gaping, toothless maw seemed to howl with the gale's mournful cry. He remembered his grandfather's stern warnings, the way the old man's eyes would narrow whenever the factory was mentioned, a place of danger, of instability. Yet it was also the place his grandfather had vanished to, returning with those strange, water-smooth stones and fragments of dark, unidentifiable metal. Now Dean knew why. He pushed through a sagging chain-link fence, the rusted metal screeching a protest that echoed through the vast emptiness. The ground beneath his boots was a treacherous mosaic of cracked concrete and loose shingle. A metallic tang, sharp and acrid, hung in the air, mingling with the salt spray and the damp earth. This wasn't just the smell of decay. It was something deeper, a stagnant, heavy scent that snagged at the back of his throat. Inside, the factory was a cathedral of ruin. Light struggled to penetrate the grime-caked skylights, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the swaying of loose rafters. Puddles of oily water reflected the skeletal framework of machinery, long since plundered or left to corrode into oblivion. He wasn't alone here. Not truly. He moved slowly, his headlamp cutting a focused beam through the gloom, scanning the vast, echoing space. He was looking for something specific, a hidden entrance, a clue from his grandfather's fragmented notes. He noticed the way the dust lay undisturbed in certain corners, thick as velvet, while in others, it seemed to have been recently agitated, as if something had dragged itself across the floor. He followed it, deeper into the factory's maw, past a rusted boiler, towards a section of the wall that seemed too solid, too uniform, for the general state of disrepair. Then, his fingers brushed against a faint ridge, barely visible beneath layers of grime. This was it. This was where the answers lay, or perhaps where everything unraveled. He gripped his headlamp, its beam trembling slightly, and stepped into the passage. The tunnel was short, descending sharply into the earth. The walls were not concrete here, but rough-hewn rock, slick with moisture. He emerged into a vast cavernous space, carved into the island's bedrock. It was not natural. The walls were impossibly smooth in places, then roughly hewn in others, as if two different hands, or two different eras, had shaped it. In the center of the chamber, bathed in an eerie phosphorescent glow that seemed to come from within itself, stood the source of the hum, It was not stone, not metal, not anything Dean could name. Its surface was a tessellation of facets and impossible angles, shifting subtly, as if breathing. This was no artifact. It was a wound in reality. A gateway. This was what his grandfather had guarded, what the island had concealed. As he stared, mesmerized and horrified, the swirling blackness within the monolith pulsed with a sudden, blinding intensity. A torrent of images, not seen with his eyes but felt directly in his mind, crashed into him. He saw the island, not as he knew it, but submerged, the lighthouse a broken spire disappearing beneath a churning, endless expanse of black water. He saw the factory collapsing, not into ruin, but into a new, grotesque form, its metal bones twisting into something organic, something that writhed and pulsed. It was not a vision of death, but of utter absorption, of his mind, his very being, dissolving into an incomprehensible, boundless awareness. He stumbled back, gasping, the metallic tang in the air suddenly overwhelming, tasting of fear and something unthinkably old. The island was a trap, the cottage a cage, and the sea not a source of solace, but a gaping maw. The entity was not just encroaching, it was claiming. And Dean, the last of his line, was its designated heir. Dean pushed against a buckling metal door, the groan of protesting hinges a shriek in the desolate air. Inside, the darkness was absolute, thick and cloying, broken only by slivers of dying light filtering through grimy, high-set windows. His breath plumed in front of him, a ghost in the vast, echoing space. He fumbled for the heavy-duty lantern he'd brought, its beam cutting a wavering path through the gloom. Towering machinery, skeletal and encrusted with rust, stretched into the unseen ceiling. Twisted pipes, like the veins of some ancient dead organism, crisscrossed the cavernous space. It felt like a tomb, waiting. It was a deep, resonant pulse, like a vast, unseen heart beating far below. Dean froze, his hand tightening on the lantern. He remembered the feeling from the lighthouse, the tremor that had rattled his very bones. They slithered and coiled, promising knowledge, demanding surrender. He squeezed his eyes shut, shaking his head violently, trying to dislodge them. It's not real. Come, yield. This was no longer just an encroaching presence. It was an active, deliberate invasion. It was reaching, probing, trying to break through the final barriers of his consciousness, to claim him. He felt it like icy tendrils brushing against the inside of his thoughts, seeking purchase, trying to unravel the threads of his very self. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum. He stumbled backwards, tripping over a discarded coil of wire, landing hard on his back. They were the same symbols he'd seen in his grandfather's journal, the ones that spoke of the deep, of the pact. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring the ache in his elbow, his gaze fixed on the symbols. They seemed to pulse with a faint internal light, mirroring the thrum beneath his feet. He remembered the journal, clutched tight in his other hand. It was his only weapon, his only hope. He sank to his knees, ignoring the grit and dampness of the concrete, and fumbled open the leather-bound book. His fingers trembled, making the pages flutter. He gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus, scanning the dense, spidery script, his eyes darting frantically across the aged paper. He flipped past familiar passages describing the island's unique currents, past the detailed star charts, past the cryptic warnings about the sleeper beneath the waves. He needed something specific, something concrete. The thrumming grew violent, shaking the very floor. Dust rained down from the high rafters. He felt as if his skull might crack open. Then a page caught his eye. It was different. He brought the lantern closer, shielding the page from the growing vibrations. The final seal. His eyes devoured the words, his mind struggling to process them through the overwhelming psychic assault. It described a method, a ritual, to sever the connection, to seal the breach that allowed the entity to touch their world. It spoke of a focal point, a convergence of energies, and a precise alignment of the island's natural forces. But as he read further, the words twisted in his gut. The ritual wasn't just about sealing. It required more. It spoke of a life's essence, a willing surrender, the ultimate offering. It wasn't just a sacrifice of time or effort. It was a sacrifice of self. The factory groaned around him, a mournful, drawn-out sound. Dean clutched the journal, his knuckles white, the terrifying truth of his grandfather's desperate last entry ringing in his ears. The way to stop it was here, in his hands. But the cost. The terrible, terrible cost. The final scrawled lines of his grandfather's journal blurred, then sharpened, as Dean's mind struggled to anchor itself against the rising tide of foreign thought. And a precise alignment of elemental conduits, drawing the essence of the keeper, his blood, into the sacrificial altar. The words were a cold, hard knot in his gut. His blood. The personal cost was not merely a loss of sanity, but a forfeiture of self, a profound severing that went beyond the physical. He wasn't just sealing a breach. He was offering a part of himself as the final lock. A tremor ran through the cottage, rattling the window panes with a sound like chattering teeth. Outside, the world was no longer merely fog-shrouded. It was dissolving. He lurched to the window, pressing his face to the cold glass. The familiar silhouette of the island's crags was gone, replaced by churning vapor that pulsed with an internal, sickly green luminescence. The sea, usually a deep, forbidding slate, now boiled with phosphorescent foam, and in its unnatural light, he saw things. Shapes, indistinct and vast, gliding just beneath the surface, leaving trails of bioluminescent slime. The familiar mournful cry of gulls was replaced by a guttural, wet croaking that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the air. The very island was becoming an extension of its abyssal domain. The few hardy trees that clung to the exposed slopes were shedding their needles, their bark weeping a viscous, black sap that steamed faintly in the frigid air. The smell of decay, of something impossibly old dying and being reborn into something worse, clawed at his throat. He was the last keeper, the last tether. His grandfather had understood, had prepared for this, had recorded the terrible truth. Dean gripped the journal, its worn leather a tangible link to a past he now understood, a burden he now accepted. He was no longer just a cartographer seeking solitude. He was a desperate man fighting for reality itself. He moved with a sudden, frantic energy, gathering the items specified in the journal's cryptic instructions. From a dusty cabinet, he retrieved a heavy iron censer, encrusted with dried salt, and what looked like fossilized barnacles. A small, tarnished silver dagger, its blade etched with symbols that pulsed with a faint internal light, lay hidden beneath a pile of old charts. Each object felt heavy with purpose, charged with an unspoken history. His eyes fell upon a rough-hewn wooden box tucked beneath a loose floorboard. He counted them, then arranged them in a circle on the cottage's small table, following the diagram in the journal. As he did, a faint hum vibrated through the wood, a low thrum that mirrored the pressure building behind his own eyes. The final clue pointed to the derelict factory on the island's northernmost point, a place Dean had always avoided, its rusting skeletal remains a blight on the natural landscape. Now it was revealed as the focal point, the convergence of energies. The choice had been made for him the moment he'd read those last lines. He pulled on his heaviest oilskin coat, the familiar weight a small comfort against the encroaching madness. The air in the cottage grew thick, heavy, as if the very walls were breathing. He could hear the low, guttural croaking growing louder, closer, echoing from the swirling mists outside. The rhythmic crash of waves against the shore now sounded less like water and more like something immense dragging itself across shingle, groaning with effort. Stepping out, Dean was immediately assaulted by the maelstrom. The wind shrieked, a living thing tearing at his clothes, trying to rip him from the earth. The air was a deluge of spray and something else, a fine glittering dust that stung his eyes and tasted of brine and decay. He fought his way through the tempest, his head bowed against the gale, the small silver dagger clutched tightly in one hand, the journal tucked securely inside his coat. The path to the derelict factory was a nightmare. The rocks, once stable, seemed to shift beneath his feet, slick with an unidentifiable slime. He heard the splash of something vast in the churning water below, a sound that resonated in his bones, vibrating with an ancient hunger. Finally, the skeletal structure of the derelict factory loomed out of the swirling green mist, a monstrous silhouette against the turbulent sky. The rust, once a dull orange, now gleamed with an iridescent sheen, pulsing faintly. He pushed open a protesting metal door, its hinges screaming in protest, and stepped inside. Rusting machinery lay strewn about like forgotten toys, draped in thick, weeping webs of an unknown organic material. The floor was slick with standing water, and the same bioluminescent slime that coated the outside. In the center, beneath a gaping hole in the roof that allowed the unnatural green light to spill in, was a raised platform. An old boiler, perhaps, or a forgotten press. Its surface was flat, wide, and strangely clean, as if scrubbed by unseen hands. This was it. The altar. The focal point. Dean stood there, the wind howling through the factory's broken walls, the sound a mournful dirge. He looked at the silver dagger in his hand, then at the empty platform. He understood now, completely, the profound, terrible sacrifice his grandfather had hinted at. The ritual demanded not just his presence, but his essence. It would sever him, not just from the entity, but from something fundamental within himself. A cost that would leave him irrevocably changed, perhaps even broken. But the alternative was the complete dissolution of his world, the drowning of all he knew beneath an unfathomable horror. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the metallic taste of the air filling his lungs. He was ready. Not the closure he'd sought for his own grief, but a final, absolute sealing. A sacrifice. His grandfather hadn't just discovered the pact. He'd been preparing to fulfill his part, to become the final keeper, to offer himself. A cold dread seeped into Dean's bones, deeper than the island's perpetual chill. He understood now. The lighthouse, he realized, was not the true locus of the ritual. It was merely a beacon, a point of observation. The true point of breach, the ancient meeting place of earth and water and something far older, was further inland, nestled amongst the island's forgotten places. The derelict factory. He remembered the old charts, his grandfather's meticulous, almost obsessive mapping of the island's geological anomalies. A specific confluence of ley lines, marked with faded red ink, converged precisely where the factory's skeletal remains jutted against the horizon. He had dismissed it as a relic of the island's brief industrial folly, but now it pulsed in his mind like a festering wound. That was where the altar lay. That was where the true pact had been made, and where it must be unmade. The journey was a blur of wind and salt spray, the path barely visible in the deepening twilight. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of brine and something else. A metallic tang like old blood, mixed with the damp decay of forgotten things. His own breath hitched in his throat, a shallow, desperate gasp against the growing pressure in his chest. He felt like he was walking through water, each step a monumental effort against an unseen current. When the derelict factory finally loomed into view, it was not merely a structure, but a gaping maw. Rust-eaten corrugated iron walls sagged inward. Skeletal girders clawed at the bruised sky, and empty windows stared like dead eyes. A constant low thrum vibrated through the very ground, a sound that bypassed his ears and resonated directly in his skull. It was the sound of immense, unfathomable power stirring, eager. Inside, the air was a putrid blend of mold, ozone, and something truly alien. A slick, briny sweetness that made his stomach clench. There, amidst the rubble and the grime, stood the altar. Strange, angular symbols were carved into its face, not etched, but seemingly grown from the stone itself, pulsing with a faint, sickly luminescence. This was it. The conduit. The portal. He felt it then. The entity. Not as a form, but as an immense, crushing presence. He clutched the ritual knife from his grandfather's hidden drawer, its blade glinting dully in the dim light. His life. He ascended the few broken steps to the altar. As he raised the knife, the factory groaned around him. Metal shrieked, glass shattered, and the very ground beneath his feet trembled violently. The air thickened, becoming almost solid, pushing against him, trying to force his back. He saw his own face, distorted, screaming, reflected in the oily sheen of the altar. He pressed the blade against his palm. A searing pain, immediate and sharp, lanced through him. As his blood touched the altar, the symbols flared with a blinding emerald light. The factory shuddered, not with destruction, but with a convulsive internal agony. The entity roared, a soundless scream that tore through Dean's very being, twisting his perception. He felt colossal tendrils of pure thought, pure hunger lashing out at him, trying to tear his mind apart. He felt his memories being ripped from him, his identity dissolving. But he held fast, his focus absolute. He began to chant the words, not from the journal, but from somewhere deeper, from the very core of his being. Words that felt as ancient as the entity itself. Words of binding and banishment. Each syllable was a struggle, forced out against the overwhelming pressure, the psychological assault. The oily residue on the floor began to steam, evaporating into a mist that smelled of ozone and victory. The entity fought back with a final, desperate surge. The ground beneath him bucked, throwing him off balance. He crumpled, but his hand remained pressed to the altar, his blood still flowing, his voice still chanting. The light pulsed one last blinding time, then faded, leaving Dean slumped against the altar, gasping, bleeding, utterly spent. The factory was silent, save for the drip of his blood onto the stone. The air, though still thick with the scent of decay, was no longer heavy with malevolence. The thrumming had ceased. The breach was sealed. He had paid the price. The cost was immense, etched into his very soul, but the island was safe. For now. His blood into the sacrificial altar. The word echoed, a cold metallic taste on his tongue. Altar. He wasn't sure if it was a place or a concept, but a terrible certainty began to bloom in his chest, chilling him from the inside out. His grandfather hadn't just observed the deep song. He had engaged with it. The lighthouse itself seemed to groan around him, timbers shifting, glass rattling in its panes. He knew where he had to go. The derelict factory. He had avoided it, sensing its malevolence, but now it was an inescapable beacon. Dean stumbled out of the lighthouse, the wind tearing at his clothes, shrieking like a banshee. The fog, denser than ever, swallowed the world beyond a few feet, turning the familiar path into a blind, treacherous trail. He moved on instinct, his feet finding purchase on the uneven ground, his hands outstretched, brushing against unseen things. The rhythmic crash of waves against the island's jagged coast was a constant, unsettling drumbeat, punctuated by the entity's ever-present hum, growing louder, more insistent. A coppery tang, distinct from the sea salt, assaulted his nose. Inside, The air was a suffocating blend of damp earth, decaying metal, and something else. Something organic and alien. Dean's breath hitched. The factory floor stretched before him, a labyrinth of corroded machinery, broken catwalks, and pools of stagnant water reflecting the faint, bruised light filtering through shattered skylights. The deep song was deafening here, a symphony of crushing pressure and primordial hunger. He navigated the treacherous floor, each step a gamble. His eyes, now attuned to the dimness, caught sight of it. In the center of the vast space, where a massive boiler once stood, was the altar. It wasn't a slab of stone, but a grotesque amalgamation of the factory's own guts. Rusted pipes, once meant to channel steam or water, now coiled and twisted, converging on a central, pulsating mass. It was a nexus of metal and something else, something alive and vaguely bioluminescent, throbbing with a sickly green light. It hummed with an unnatural energy, a low, guttural vibration that resonated deep within Dean's own chest. His grandfather's journal had been a map, a desperate, damning confession. This factory, this altar, was a conduit, not for power, but for containment. The elemental conduits were the very pipes and machinery, repurposed. And the essence of the keeper and his blood wasn't for sacrifice in the traditional sense, but for a binding. Dean realized with a sickening lurch that his grandfather hadn't defeated the entity. He had merely fed it, offering himself and his lineage as a slow, agonizing psychic drain to maintain the delicate balance. And now, with his grandfather gone, the pact was breaking. The entity was stirring, hungry, the conduit weakening, demanding a new keeper, a new bloodline to feed upon. Dean was meant to be the next one. The true horror wasn't the entity itself, but the insidious generational burden, the slow, deliberate consumption. A wave of profound despair washed over him, threatening to buckle his knees. He could feel tendrils of thought, not his own, probing the edges of his mind, testing the fragile walls of his sanity. The deep song promised oblivion, a release from the crushing weight of existence, if only he would surrender. But then, a flicker of defiance. His grandfather had maintained the pact, but Dean could break it. There had to be another way. He wasn't a keeper. He was a cartographer. His eyes scanned the altar, searching for a weakness, a flaw in its ancient design. The glowing core throbbed, sending out ripples of pure, malevolent energy. He saw a series of corroded levers, connected to massive groaning valves along the central pipework. These weren't for feeding the entity, he realized, but for regulating the flow, perhaps even for severing it. His grandfather had built in a failsafe, a desperate final option, perhaps even one he never intended to use. To cut the entity off entirely, to starve it, meant risking its full, unbridled fury. It would be a gamble, a terrifying, irreversible choice. With a guttural cry, Dean lunged for the closest lever. It was thick with rust, refusing to budge. The deep song intensified, a piercing shriek in his mind, trying to deter him, to drive him mad. He felt phantom hands clutching at his throat, icy water filling his lungs. He ignored it, gritting his teeth, straining every muscle. Slowly, agonizingly, the lever began to move, scraping against its ancient housing. A jolt, like 1,000 volts, shot through his body as the mechanism engaged. The glowing core of the altar flickered violently, its bioluminescence dying, then flaring with renewed, desperate intensity. The pipes shrieked, a sound of tearing metal and rending flesh. Dean collapsed, gasping for air, his body trembling uncontrollably. He had done it. The immediate threat was neutralized. The conduit was severed. The pact was broken. But the cost. The whispers were gone, but the silence was worse. A gaping wound in his perception. The world felt thin, fragile. Dean pushed himself to his feet, a profound weariness dragging at his limbs. He stumbled out of the derelict factory into the persistent fog. The island felt different now, no longer merely menacing, but utterly desolate. A tomb for a shattered pact. He carried the burden of knowledge, the terrifying awareness of what truly lurked beneath the waves. He had escaped, yes, but his sanity was a fractured thing, forever tainted by the deep song. He was free, perhaps, but irrevocably lost.